Good morning, everyone. There's a handout that's going around. You'll want to grab one of those. I think Noah's got them at this point. So raise your hand if you need one. Anybody? Perfect. All right. Well, welcome back after a snowy week. Glad you made it. We're going to continue this series that we've been doing on the prophets. And we get into Jeremiah this morning, which is a really interesting book. And so I was hoping, because Jeremiah is a book that is filled with really rich imagery, powerful metaphors, I would have hoped that the St. John's Bible would do us well in helping to conceptualize some of these really powerful metaphors. This is the only image for Jeremiah, so I'm not disappointed, but it certainly would have been helpful. That's not the right one, but we certainly do get some beauty in here. So this is coming from the first chapter of Jeremiah, so the calling, which we're going to spend a fair amount of time with, talking about the establishment of these ideas of what it means to be a prophet, of what it means to really be part of the covenant, and how Jeremiah might have understood covenant, how God might understand covenant. All of these are at play. So we certainly get some beautiful imagery coming from the calling of Jeremiah. So, before we kind of jump in, who's done a lot of work? Who could tell, if you were asked right now to stand up and give a full account of Jeremiah, who would feel comfortable doing it? Good, all right. This class is going to go a lot better for me then, okay? Jeremiah is a complicated book, and it's complicated for lots of different reasons. As we see with lots of different books in the Bible, it's retelling parts of different stories that have already come up. So part of what we need to do is look at the deep contextual historical knowledge of where Jeremiah is placed, which we can do with some other books in the Bible, but we can also, we need to understand different types of prose, different types of literature, because this is all happening in Jeremiah. We get all sorts of different things. We'll also see that it's not a chronological book. It's not following a A to B linear fashion. So we're not getting a full written narrative that was written from one point to another, which we see in a lot of the Old Testament. You'll also see, similar to with Isaiah, it's written at different time periods. So there are three kind of what we're going to call cycles of Jeremiah that are talking about different things at different times, and whether they were written at different times, different authors, different understandings, it's really hard to say, but there are some distinct cycles within the book that point to different things that are going on in Jeremiah. So we'll take a look at a little bit of all of that, but I want us to start really with the calling, which is such an important piece of any prophet's call. I'm going to pull up our trusty Bible software here that I like to use for different courses. I wonder if someone might read this for us. We're going to spend some time talking about the call. Does anybody feel so called as to read? Thank you, Andrew. We'll read this kind of first chapter of Jeremiah, because I think it explains a lot of what's going on, or at least it says that. We're waking up now. We're good. All right, take it away.
The words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, of the priests who were in Anathoth, in the land of Benjamin, to whom the word of the Lord came in the days of King Josiah, son of Ammon of Judah, in the 13th year of his reign. It came also in the days of King Jehoiakim, son of Josiah of Judah, and until the end of the 11th year of King Zedekiah, son of Josiah of Judah, until the captivity of Jerusalem in the 5th month.
All right, we're going to come back to that, but here's the calling.
Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. Then I said, Ah, Lord God, truly I do not know how to speak, for I am only a boy. But the Lord said to me, Do not say I am only a boy, for you shall go to all to whom I send you, and you shall speak whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, says the Lord. Then the Lord put out his hand and touched my mouth, and the Lord said to me, Now I have put my words in your mouth. See, today I appoint you over nations and over kingdoms, to pluck up and to pull down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant.
And we'll stop there. There's a lot that goes in there. So I'll grab that mic again. So a couple of very important contextual pieces that have been set just in this first part of Jeremiah. And so let's go back up to the top here. We're going to see a couple names in here that we're going to see a lot as we do this study. So Jeremiah is coming within about a 40-year period that we're looking at. So we understand Jeremiah the prophet to have about 40 years of ministry, of this prophetic witness and call. And it's coming over the span of about 5 different kings, of which 3 are listed here. But as you read through the text, you'll see some of those other names. You'll also see that if you went back and read Kings and Chronicles, you'll see some of that same sort of pattern of kings that's happening. So 3 to note, we've got Josiah, we've got Jehoiakim, and then we have Zedekiah. So those are the 3 major kings that we need to kind of be aware of as we're talking about Jeremiah. So we're setting right here in the first paragraph, the first opening sentences of the book, what time period we're looking at, what this is all about. So this is a really important historical anchor to some of the oracles that are coming up next. And we'll need to understand some of that historical nature to really get into the grid of why is Jeremiah being so angry and mean? What does he understand? Like, where are these prophetic oracles of doom and gloom, where are they coming from? And we have to understand the historical context of what's going on to really kind of sink into that. So we're looking at this time in the life of Judah, which is about 627, which is the first year that we think of as Jeremiah at BCE, all the way to about 587 at BCE. So that 40-year time frame, and it's the end of Judah as we know it. It's kind of the last 40 years until the fall of Jerusalem at the hands of the Babylonian Empire, at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. So that's kind of where we are and what's going on, and this kind of, again, this flow of kings and flow of righteousness that's happening and how they all understand it. So turn with me to page 2 in your little handout here where we've got these maps. It's just helpful to look at some of this. Look at that figure on the bottom. So you've got 3 different things to look at. At the very top of that, you've got this idea of foreign powers. So what's happening for Josiah is that he's facing threats from Assyria. So the Assyrian Empire is the dominant force at the time. And there's this bit of syncretism that's happening between Judah and Assyria. Some of the kings prior to Josiah are engaged in a level of kind of, well, yeah, we'll do some of the things that Assyria is asking us to do in our religious life so that we get crushed and don't, stop to be in existence. So they kind of abandon their covenant with God, with Yahweh, for a little bit, and go and do some, so this word syncretism often means like the blending together of 2 different religions and traditions. So there's this syncretism that's happening. And of course, in a covenantal relationship with God, that's something that in a monotheistic culture, in an understanding of sole reliance on God, that's something that's not going to go well. So that's their first kind of piece that we're looking at, is that there's this syncretism happening. Josiah actually comes in as a bit of a reformer. And if you turn to the back page, you'll see the outline of 2 Kings here. So Josiah begins his reign in the 22nd chapter of 2 Kings. The repairing of the temple and this finding of the law and a renewal of the covenant. So we see Josiah as a bit of a reformer, of trying to get rid of these syncretistic practices with the Assyrian Empire. And Jeremiah is largely on board with that, but there are some other things that happen. Josiah ends up dying in battle in Egypt, and there's a second king that comes in whose name is not coming to me right now. It's on the back here, though, isn't it? Yeah. So we're back on page 2. I'm going to have you jump around a lot. I'm sorry today, but that's your first lesson in Jeremiah. It's not chronological. We're going to be jumping around a lot, and to really understand some of the deep contextual historical areas that are going on, it will behoove us in the end. So we're down here in the king section on that bottom diagram. So we've got Josiah from 640 all the way up to about 609. And then you have Jehoahaz, was king for 3 months, which then leads in to the kingship of Jehoiakim, which is the second king that we heard about at the start of Jeremiah in here. So Jehoiakim comes in, and he is at first kind of a vassal of the Babylonian Empire. So the first thing that happens is Babylon kind of defeats the Assyrian Empire. So it's the waning days of the Assyrian Empire having hold over the land is the end of Josiah's reign. And then you come into the Babylonian Empire, which has taken over and defeated the Assyrian Empire, and so now has control of Judah. So they are the major force within the area. So get rid of the Assyrians, and then you have Jehoiakim coming in, and you have the Babylonian Empire. So we have Nebuchadnezzar, and some of these other names you'll remember as we kind of go through this. But Jehoiakim is first seen as sort of a vassal of Nebuchadnezzar. Again, sort of this battle between how do we continue to exist as a people with this major threat that goes above us. And so some of these things go back and forth, but what eventually happens is that Jehoiakim revolts against Nebuchadnezzar which Jeremiah says, don't do that. And he revolts against Nebuchadnezzar and is thrown out and is killed. And so we have this first siege of Jerusalem that happens at the end of Jehoiakim's reign, which then pushes the first displacement of the people of Judah into Babylon. So this is the first part of the exile that we see happening at the end of the reign of Jehoiakim. And you'll see that noted somewhere in the confusing little diagram that's down there, but it's in there, trust me. So Jehoiakim is disposed, and then you have Jehoiachin that is put into kingship, into the monarchy, which is, again, a very short-lived reign. And then we get to Zedekiah, which, we have that same sort of pattern of first seen as a friend and a vassal of the Babylonian Empire, but then is pushed out and revolts against Babylon, against Nebuchadnezzar, again, against the advice of Jeremiah. And is overthrown and is killed. And so that forces the last sort of displacement of Judah. So the major exile of the people of Israel, of Judah, into Babylon. That's where the exile takes place. So that is kind of the historical context for what we're talking about here. And that's over a 40-year span. And so what we start to see in Jeremiah then is a bit of this storytelling back and forth, kind of fluidly throughout time, of these different instances where Jeremiah has given advice And the kings say, of course, I'll do that. And then they go and do something else. And so it's this back and forth that eventually leads to the destruction. And I think one thing that's complicated about Jeremiah is the way in which I think the covenantal relationship is understood with the idea of Babylon destroying Judah. So what's going on there? That's one thing that we'll have to look at. So I think an important piece that we have to look at is who Jeremiah is and who he is formed and how he's been formed and what he would have understood in terms of this covenantal relationship, which is something we're going to get into in just a little bit. So the calling of Jeremiah here in Jeremiah 1:4. Now the Lord came to me saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. What's happening right there? Andrew?
Basically, like, he was like the very instant he was born special, basically.
Yeah, so this idea of calling even before we're born, of this special time and place. So he is anointed before he even comes out. So yes. What else is happening here? Specifically about the construct of time.
Well, it sounds like he's a child prophet at this point.
Child prophet, yeah. Yeah, so he is called early, we can certainly say that. But even before Jeremiah, what is...
There's a plan.
Oh, there's a plan, yeah. So I think one thing to point out in this, and I think what's so beautiful about this opening passage is that with all of the horribleness that's going to follow, God is saying that God exists outside of time, really, which is one of the things we understand in the traditional understanding of God. So someone that's omnipotent, omnipotent, and omniscient. So all-knowing, all-seeing, and existing within all time. So that also means that God's understanding of what time looks like is completely different than what the human understanding of time. And so to call Jeremiah early, to say, I knew you in the womb before I even formed you in the womb. This is part of who you are going to be. This is part of the understanding of the world that I have that exists outside of time. When I really start to do some of the theologizing around God and why it's so hard to be human, the question of time comes back to me almost every time, just because we exist within a very linear A to B fashion, A to B, B to C. We understand the patterns of the earth to be, stretching forward forever, and we can't go back ever. But if you exist, that's a problem of existing within time. God existing outside of time, of being fully involved and present at all times, is something that really changes how you understand God being involved. So this is one of those statements, yeah.
I want to ask you, where is Isaiah in all this? How much before is this?
That's a great question. What did Noah tell you?
Because I'm looking here at your time
Yeah.
where Daniel is, and he talked a lot about the Assyrians and things like that too. So whereabouts, because he was
Isaiah's before, I want to say.
before.
Yeah. Yeah, he's about a century before. See, George is here. Thanks, George. But it's also, Isaiah is one of the ones, like we'll talk about in Jeremiah in just a second. It's written at different times. It's not a single author.
So he's kind of flowing in here as well.
Yeah, so...
Some of his later stuff.
And some of the later Isaiah, you'll certainly understand the Babylonian captivity to be part of that. And so that's why we understand it to be a little different outside of the time. Yes. That's a great question, though. Thank you. So, yeah, yes.
I have a question about the Babylonian captivity and exile. Does that truly mean that the people were moved from one location to another?
Yes.
Or does it mean it does?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so they were kicked out of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was sacked and all the spoils taken, and the people physically moved. And that's actually going to be a big piece of the story, because there is a remnant that stays behind in Jerusalem, and we'll see in Jeremiah, it doesn't go well for them. And so part of the understanding of that, again, is again, I think what is so complicated about this narrative, and I don't want to get to this point too early because we've got a lot of ground setting to do, but we'll start to see that even Jeremiah understands Nebuchadnezzar to be, and the Babylonian Empire to be part of what is the covenantal relationship that God is establishing. So the way to keep Israel alive, to keep the covenant together, is Nebuchadnezzar coming in and destroying everything that is. And that's a hard piece to understand, but I also think that's certainly a reading into Jeremiah that we can have. But I don't want to get to that point too early, so don't ask me questions on that yet. All right, because we haven't read any of Jeremiah yet, so we got to get some of it into this. So I just want to hit again this point about time and about understanding of what God understands, because it's very different than the human understanding. But that's what Jeremiah is writing from very much, is this idea of God's understanding into human words. And so we have this idea of metaphor that comes up a lot, and we'll look at one instance of metaphor maybe this morning, maybe next week, because we've got 2 weeks with Jeremiah, which is fun. But it's really important then to understand about what is God trying to enact through the world as it happens, and how can we communicate about what is being enacted through the world with the people in a way that they will understand it. And I think that's part of the task of a prophet, and that's certainly part of the task of Jeremiah. And so we'll see, as we've already brought in some of the other prophets that we know of, so Isaiah. We certainly understand Moses to be a prophet and this really important leader in the Jewish tradition. And so in the tradition that Jeremiah is, of course, raised up in and brought up in. And so you'll see again then in Jeremiah 6, this kind of pattern of it's a likeness to Moses. It's a likeness to the understanding of what Moses was doing.
The reluctance.
That's exactly right, yes.
It seems to me, I thought of Moses and then Jonah and are there prophets who immediately say, oh yeah, I'm a prophet? Or do they all have to go through this moment of discernment?
It's never a good thing to be called a prophet. I think that's the general theme that we get, is that the task and the work that you are having to do as a prophet is not something you are going to take lightly. So I mean, to think about it in the sense of God has called you to stand up and to push back against every single whim of your society, and to be the voice of reason and to say the hard things that need to be said in a world that has been broken for a long time. That's difficult work, and that's some of the work that we'll see in every single prophet that we look at. Yes, Jared? Say that again? Oof. Great question. The question was, would today's prophets be politicians? It's an interesting question. You'll certainly see in Jeremiah this idea that it's not just the outcasts that are part of the tradition, part of the prophetic idea. Because we see that a lot, like with John, the prophet John, in the wilderness, of being outside of the world, critiquing inwardly, which is one method of being a prophet. But Jeremiah is involved in what's going on. He is sought out by the people that are in charge. And so this idea that he is part of the system that he is critiquing, I think, is also important to who he is. So to bring that into the modern sense, like Jared has done, pointing out modern prophets is a difficult choice. But I think I don't want to go into Noah's sermon too much this morning, but if you were at the 8 o'clock, I think that'll resonate with you, that question that Jared just asked. And I'll let Noah answer it for the 10:15 folks too. So if you haven't heard it, I think that question could be answered a lot by what Noah has to say at 10:15. So that's a plug. Go this morning. Yeah.
Is it fair to say that the military battles are over worldly things, economic and political power that we're talking about?
Certainly, not being a full biblical historian and to talk about the actual, what is provable about some of these narratives that are being told in a historical sense, it's difficult, and I don't want to give a half answer here, but certainly it's the power dynamics at play. So Assyria, when Josiah is in reign, is the major force and is spreading out in the region to be dominant, to have control of political, monetary, flow of goods, that kind of stuff. So there's that, but there's also the question of identity. So some of this is about who are we and how do we understand ourselves. But I think we would do ourselves a disservice to disconnect those because, we're talking about ideas of systems as well. This is not a time where your understanding of your political understanding or your monetary way of being is disconnected from your God and what what your God is doing for you. And that's part of the covenantal relationship. That's part of what Jeremiah is critiquing. And when we get to some of these other these laments that we'll see in the early chapters of Jeremiah, that's what's happening, is that there is this saying, maybe I'll just jump into this now. Jeremiah has what we would call a Deuteronomistic understanding of the world. And so that, again, is likening back to Moses, likening back to the call of Moses, this covenantal relationship. And so covenantal relationships work in the sense that you both keep up the end of your bargain. So if God fails to follow through on what God says God will do, then the humans are not responsible for keeping up their end of the bargain, and vice versa. If the humans don't keep up their end of the covenant, then God is not responsible for doing what God said God would do in the covenant. So you'll see that kind of theology come out of Jeremiah. Now, we don't have that sort of theology, which I want to be important to say, because we understand, and I think, again, thinking of God outside of time, outside of this very specific moment, to say that God is letting all of this befall people because they did not hold up their end of the bargain, which is very much the case that Jeremiah is trying to make. I think we can also see, having a fuller understanding of the Bible and the course of salvific history and where the story goes after this point, there's something else that's starting here that God is trying to do. And so, again, you'll see Jeremiah refer to Nebuchadnezzar as God's servant, which is a really, really weird thing to put together, to say that Nebuchadnezzar is actually doing the work of God by destroying God's people. But so that there's something else that's going on within this text. So to your question, I mean, it would say that part of the issues that Jeremiah has with the people of Judah is that they are turning towards the Assyrian beliefs because of what's going on within their political lives, within their livelihoods, their monetary ways of being. Yeah.
The Puritans had a sermon called Jeremiah that would complain about the lament about the golden age and falling off from the golden age of the covenant. And in time, that would be sort of like a decline.
Mm-hmm. I mean, You would certainly see that. What the golden age of Judah is often how Josiah's reign is referred to. So when things are working the best, it's still broken, but it's still working well for people. It's really after Josiah, when you get into Jehoiakim and the fall of the Assyrian power and the structure that comes with the Assyrian power of the world, that some of the major changes happen. Yeah, the declension. So it's again this rise and fall. And so we see in Judges, we see in Kings that same sort of pattern of a rise of a king that says they'll do good, and then they fall, and there you need a judge that comes in and tells them how to do better. And so it's this pattern of how we call back and forth, and a cyclical nature, because we all strive to do good, but we also get turned in ways that we don't intend. And so then that's the question of what is God's relationship with us, even in the fall, even when things are not going well for us and seems like the world is sort of at its end. And you could certainly say that the fall of Jerusalem, which we'll get to in the end of Jeremiah, is a world-ending event for the people of Judah, and it certainly feels that way. But what is God doing with the remnant that exists in Babylon? So the questions of diaspora, the questions of what does it look like to be removed from your cultural heritage but still keeping the faith, those are really powerful questions. And that's why you'll see Jeremiah used a lot, and some of the prophets that talk about what it's like in the time of Babylonian captivity. It's used a lot in liberation theology. It's used a lot in people that were fighting for the end of slavery in the United States, because it speaks to people saying, we're not where we should be, and we still understand a relationship with God, and what that should look like. So, yeah.
Is it inappropriate to go and wonder if embedded in the verses there's not a little bit of the foretelling of Christ and the future? It's outside of our traditional concepts of time,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm wondering if there's not a bit embedded in that of a foretelling.
That's a great question. I think we always have to be careful in that understanding, because a big piece of what we don't want to do is to try to read the good news, try to read the Gospels into the Old Testament, because it doesn't work that way, because we are in a linear fashion. Like, the Gospels are much later, and so we can certainly say that there's evidence that God is working beyond the understanding of the time of the people that are writing this. And to what extent that comes true in Jesus, I think we certainly make that connection. But I want to be clear in that we're not reading the gospel narrative into what's happening here, because that creates its own sort of problems. It creates its own sort of saying that none of this actually matters or was important, when it's deeply important. But that's a really great question. I'm gonna, yeah, go ahead.
It could be possible that the writers of the Gospels were aware of this writing and wanted to call back to something familiar to their readers.
Yes, and so that's very true, and that does happen. I mean, you'll see in the gospel passage from this morning of Jesus himself calling back to Isaiah. So that's why it's really important to have the chronology in our minds, so that we know that the Gospels are much later and are using these other sources, so that they are drawing upon the rich tradition of which they have been formed to tell this story and to tell who they think Jesus is. And Jesus tells that story himself of saying, again, I don't want to get into Noah's sermon, but it's this, Isaiah 61, the freeing of the captives. I'm saying today this has been fulfilled in your presence. That's Jesus saying, I am the fulfillment of these texts. But what I want to be clear is that we're not saying that the writers of Jeremiah are looking forward to something like Jesus, because their understanding of Messiah is very much different than what the Messiah we get in Jesus Christ. So, but we do see a pattern of them looking at, it's almost like a reflective sort of thing of Jesus looking back to Isaiah and some of the prophets. The writer of Jeremiah is looking back and understanding himself in the history of his own area. So we're looking at Moses. So I just want to look at this quickly before we move into something else. But it says right here in Jeremiah 1:6, then I said, Lord God, truly I do not know how to speak, for I am only a boy. But the Lord said to me, do not say I am only a boy, for you shall go to all to whom I send you, and you shall speak whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you, says the Lord. So again, you'll see that sort of callback to Moses of saying that Moses really did not want to do what Moses had to do. And God supports Moses by raising up Aaron to kind of be the voice of the people while Moses made the decisions. But God was prepared for all the protestations of Moses, and you'll also see that God is prepared for the protestations of Jeremiah as well. So this calling is very important. So, I have put my words in your mouth. See, today I appoint you over nations and over kingdoms to pluck up and to pull down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant. I'm going to move us to Jeremiah 2 here, because we're going to start to move into some of these oracles. So, turn with me to the top of the third page, the one with the graph on it. Is it really 950? Good Lord. All right. Woo! We'll get into some of reading of Jeremiah next week, which will be good for us all, I think. But I think setting up some of the context is really important. You'll see at the kind of the top issue, the top corner there where I typed out the literary styles, we're working with lots of different things here. So we're going to see oracles, and part of that is poetry as well. So these kind of prophetic statements about what Judah has done and what God will do in response to that. So some of that is good, some of that is bad, but it's oracle, so we have to understand it in that. It's also heavily using metaphor. So metaphor is going to come out a lot in Jeremiah. And I think what we'll start with next week is this section in Jeremiah 2 that sets up this metaphor that kind of plays out through this first section of oracle here. But you've also got a bit of personal narrative. So if you look, something later, like if you go to Jeremiah 26, this is a lot more like you would see in other portions of the Old Testament. So this is reading more like 2 Kings, more like a historical document than it is like oracle. And so we've kind of got this mash of things that are going on. So it's part of the reason Jeremiah can be difficult to read is that you're switching between these different types of literature all at once, and you're kind of having to put together the history that we've just talked about into the oracles without understanding where they are. But then you also have some historical additions that are counter to, not counterpart, but a part of what's happening in Kings and Chronicles. So you'll get a retelling of some of those stories. So you definitely see the author of Jeremiah pulling in some of those stories. And even Chronicles will then, which must be later because it goes back and uses Jeremiah to say, well, part of why Jehoiakim and part of why Zedekiah befall or meet their fate is because they didn't listen to Jeremiah. So you'll see this. It's got a very specific point within the literature, the literary history of the Old Testament. But so we've got personal narrative, historical narrative. We've got biography, so telling some of the story of Jeremiah. But we also have to understand some of these oracles as sermons and as speeches of Jeremiah standing in the temple and actually saying some of these things to people. So it's not just written down, but we also see some of that as well. So you'll see later where he starts talking about his friend Baruch, who is his scribe, and so who Jeremiah will tell all of these oracles to, and Jeremiah writes them down so that they are preserved. So we've got lots of stuff that's going on in here, which can make Jeremiah kind of difficult to understand. You'll also see a huge or one of the issues of interpretation is that the authorship and the revision of Jeremiah is complicated as well. So again, we're on this page with the different cycles with the graph on it. So we're looking at those cycles right there. And like I said, those cycles are very distinct forms in the text where we can't say for sure that that's where a break happened or why it breaks specifically like there, but particularly at 1 through 25 and then moving into 26, like right here, this statement here, well, let me go back to the very first one, sorry. You'll see this language here at the beginning of the reign of King Jehoiakim, son of Josiah of Judah. This word came from the Lord, thus says the Lord. And so we've reset. If you were reading from 1 to 25 at that point, this would have been a major reset because we were just talking about Zedekiah. So we just got to some of the oracles that we're talking about the very end of the time of Jeremiah, and now we're resetting. So we're going back in time back to Jehoiakim, which is 2 kings before Zedekiah. And you'll see a similar sort of jump at 46, if we go there. And then thus came so we're going back to Jehoiakim, which again, so that cycle of 26 to 45 would have done the same sort of thing, walking from Jehoiakim through the end of Zedekiah and the fall of Jerusalem. You'll get a first account of that. But then at 46, we move into a whole other thing. We're back in time. We're reliving in what's known as the oracles to the nation. So this other prophetic sort of style that's going on here. And then at the end, at 52, we'll get a second telling of the fall of Jerusalem under Zedekiah. So that's why the cycles exist where they are, or you could put them like that. Different scholars will put the different cycles at different places. So if you look at the top diagram on page 2 there, you'll see book 1, book 2, and supplements. That's sometimes how you see it referred to. So in terms of the authorship and the revision of this, the Septuagint, which is the Latin version of the Old Testament, written in Latin, has a very different order to Jeremiah. And it actually puts the oracles to the nations, which begins here at 46, which is talking about all of the nations that are not a part of Judah and what's going to happen to them. That goes in the Septuagint after 25. So it comes much earlier, and then you have some other stuff that's going on. So some scholars think that that's because it's an earlier understanding of how the original Jeremiah might have looked, or certainly an earlier version of the order of Jeremiah, and that pushes it through. But all that to say is that there is there's key evidence of revision that happens long into the history of Jeremiah. So we're not dealing with a document, and I would say this about every book in the Old Testament. We're not dealing with a document that was, written down. I'm writing this today, and I'm starting at chapter 1, and I'm going to 52, and then I'm turning it in to my professor, and I'm leaving it at that. It's a document that has had tons of revision over hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years by different people. And so what we are looking at is a historical document with lots of revision of how people understand themselves. And so there's great evidence to that. So that's why you see different things happening, and that's why we get these different cycles the way that they are. We're going to have to stop there, and we have read maybe the first chapter. All right? So what we'll do next week is we'll start with some of the metaphor, looking at that, start with some of these oracles that happen in Jeremiah that are so important to it. I'm going to talk less about the actual history that we've set today. So come with that in mind. It might actually be really helpful for you to go to the 2 Kings readings. So read 2 Kings chapter 22 through 25 if you have the time. And that will set in your mind the historical context to which Jeremiah is writing, which I think will behoove us as we start to look at those. So again, that's your homework. 2 Kings chapters 22 through 25. It'll take you 30 minutes. It'll be great. And then next week, we'll start to actually read some of these oracles and then look at some of the really wonderful language that exists later in Jeremiah to understand what's happening in the covenant beyond the terrible nature and the fate of the world as it is in the current day. So that's where I want to leave us next week. So cool. We'll see you then. Thanks, everybody.